So, the new Gundam series, with the very pronounceable name, is not a Hideaki Anno joint, but it does feature a prologue written by Anno, one that takes place during an alternate version of the original Gundam series. According to an interview translated by Zionic Scans, this section was initially intended to be a 5-minute prologue, but Anno got carried away and handed in a 40-minute segment. This is the section of the narrative that opened the compilation film shown months before the television run. And this creates an odd viewing experience, the movie version opening with an almost self-contained reworking of the original series. If you remove that section and watch it on its own, it could work alongside a lot of recent Anno films, like Shin Godzilla, Ultraman, and Kamen Rider, which play with media properties he grew up with. In that interview, Anno was asked which scene in this segment was the most important to him, and the scene he chose was really interesting. It's a piece of dialogue in which Char and Chalia Bull drink wine. I wanted a scene, he says, where they just sit down over wine and talk, yet somehow both come across as compelling just through their dialogue. And like the rest of the prologue, this is also a way for Anno to play in the sandbox of the original show. As he says, while writing those lines, I tried my best to channel Tomino, the original creator of Gundam's, spirit, like he was guiding my hand. How would Tomino phrase this? That became a personal litmus test for me. I think I got it at least somewhat close in the end. Even before seeing the movie, I perked up at reading this. Tomino's dialogue style is incredibly specific, and it's very rarely attempted to be imitated. But because it's such an idiosyncratic style, I'm fascinated by attempts to capture it. Tomino himself isn't always listed as a writer on every series he's worked on, but it's well known that he usually heavily rewrites episode scripts, which is why his work always has that distinctive mouthfeel, would that be the word? So how would I define that Tomino style of writing? Well, there's been various terms for it in fandom, some more obnoxious than others. But if I was to try and define Tomino dialogue, I would mention a few things. I sometimes describe the writing in Tomino's work as having an elliptical judder. Characters seem to talk past each other, speaking in allusions or non sequiturs, and two people having a conversation rarely seem to reach an agreement. Usually they're both more confused at the end than they were at the start. This ties into Tomino's general interest in people not understanding one another, as well as his fixation on characters who don't really seem to understand themselves. Characters in Tomino's work keep their cards close to their chests, which is complicated further as often those characters can't actually play poker. There have been some other recent attempts to evoke this dialogue style. Gundam Hathaway keeps much of it. One of its first pieces of dialogue is a middle-aged man's somewhat clunky attempt at flirting, taken directly from the novel. But it also massively streamlines that conversation, removing most of its asides and digressions, the characteristic Tomino switching between subjects. If you're interested, you can pause the video for my little breakdown of how this conversation flows in the novel versus the film. But the film version basically has that same sense of repartee, however shaved down to its essentials. In contrast, I think the flashback sequence in G-Quacks is trying to channel this style for the entirety of the segment. It wants every line to be arch in this way, letting you know that it takes place in a specific kind of reality. So, does it capture Tomino's style perfectly, one-to-one? Well, because I can't speak Japanese, I'm sure I'm missing 90% of what the actual feel of Tomino's dialogue is in its native language. In that interview I mentioned, they described it as sounding somewhat intentionally archaic, like what you'd hear in a period drama. But if I had seen this without knowing who the director was, would I have assumed it was a Tomino work? Well, no. It's never possible to truly recreate the style of a particularly idiosyncratic writer, but I think it does capture the spirit of Tomino's work. As Anno says in that interview, it was more about capturing that intangible aura in Tomino's writing, the overall feelings his lines exude, and on that, I think it succeeds. Crucially, the characters don't immediately say what they want. They court each other, talking around issues while trying to put on their best airs. Chalia Bull begins the wine scene by commenting on the wine, a left bank Bordeaux from the previous century. Char doesn't respond to this. He instead immediately points out Chalia being caught between two different factions in the military. Chalia responds that he's not shrewd like Char, i.e. he can't play those sides against each other. Char suggests a solution, to ally with him. The conversation turns to Chalia asking what they'll do if they win the war, and Char gives the diverting response, "It's not good to peek too much into people's hearts." But regardless, he says, the two won't be able to keep secrets from each other anyway, should they lie. Then they shake hands and it's agreed. The alliance is cemented. I think playing in this sandbox is a really nice full circle moment for Anno. The rhythm of his dialogue isn't quite the same as Tomino, but it was definitely an influence, and Anno shares an interest in characters who don't say what they mean, and who have motivations they themselves aren't always aware of. Here, we get to see him tip his hat fully to that style. It's a little play at the centre of the episode, basically. Two men drink wine, have a dodging, slightly elliptical conversation, and then agree they are brothers for life. Hideaki Anno's recent career has been mostly praised. Shin Godzilla, Ultraman, and Kamen Rider are largely seen as exciting and respectful tributes to the pop culture works that inspired him, but there are also critiques of this era of Anno. It's more and more common to see people describing these films as Anno playing with his toys, no longer willing to entirely emotionally engage with his works, instead just reorganizing the motifs of his childhood. And I'm sort of between these two opinions. Hideaki Anno's work, from Gunbuster in 1988 to Ritual in the year 2000, is probably the closest I feel to any director's filmography. I'm particularly close to Nadia, Evangelion, and Love and Pop, and I often feel that they capture how I perceive the world better than basically any other work of art. A big part of their appeal is in their mix of styles. Much of these are just great examples of genre fiction television. As much as Evangelion and Nadia begin to feel like existential novels in their back half, they're also ideal Monster of the Week shows. Visually, and particularly in their editing, they are experimental, constantly trying new things, but often in a way that feels delightfully amateurish. You could say art film-esque, but maybe it's more student film-esque. There's a slightly naive optimism here about the freedom of where the camera can go. And there's also that postmodern grandiosity this stuff has. Yes, we will have an apocalypse that climaxes with the form of the film undoing itself, the camera directly staring at the audience. Yes, we will have this story of teenage angst conclude with our heroine turning into a crude CGI version of herself that, along with the mess of her cluttered room, will be thrown into the air at the height of her melancholy monologue. No one says we can't, and besides, the millennium is coming, the world will probably end soon anyway. At the same time, and without downplaying the fact that I am an unrepentant auteurist, these are also the works of Anno's collaborators. Nadia, Evangelion, and Love and Pop likely wouldn't have their more cautious, mature moments without the writing of Akio Satsukawa. We shouldn't forget that many of the most beloved episodes of NGE were written by him, and Anno attributes much of the series' tone to his work. When it comes to the Shin series, Anno and Shinji Higuchi are working to evoke the styles of the creative teams that were so instrumental in their childhood. Much of Shin Ultraman is Higuchi's attempt to capture the look of director Akio Jisoji, the new wave alum who went on to work on Ultraman episodes. What I sometimes say the Shin series reminds me of, and go with me on this, is an Alex Ross painting. Alex Ross is an American comics artist, a painter actually, with a very realistic, immediate style. His work evokes that feeling of being a child and imagining what your favourite superheroes would look like in the real world. And he doesn't try to modernize the designs of these heroes. They look plainly like men in tights, but his Rockwell-esque lighting gives his work a sense of photographic realism mixed with iconicity. And similarly, the Shin series doesn't seek to massively subvert its original stories. It's more interested in looking at these characters and boiling them down to their essentials, asking what is at the root of characters like Ultraman, Godzilla, and Kamen Rider. At their simplest, what defines these characters, what makes them work? And it does that very effectively. But still, I should note that I don't entirely disagree with the critics. I do feel a slight emotional distance from these films. As much as I like them, I've also accepted that I'll likely never be as emotionally attached to an Anno work as I was to the stuff he did in the 90s. And that's totally fine, by the way. No creator owes me their inner life at all times. And if the rest of Anno's career will just be him playing with the toys of his youth, that's fine by me. Still, even when working in tribute mode, Anno's visual fixations are unavoidable. There are clearly certain images that just speak to him. Trains, power lines, telephone poles, etc. In a documentary on Anno from the 90s, in which he returns to his hometown Ube, he talks about his love of industrial environments, how he would mainly paint industrial environments in high school without really focusing on human figures within them. I think that part of what's interesting about Anno's gaze as a director is how he grants beauty to these somewhat functional industrial scenes. More than granting them beauty, actually, he constructs a world dominated by them, a space of serpentine train carriages and cobwebs of telephone wires. And all his Shin films have this fixation on industrial locations. It's very effective in Shin Godzilla, where Godzilla itself feels both organic and oddly mechanical, emphasized by its cold, unblinking eyes. I love in that movie how Godzilla at times seems barely aware of his surroundings. Goji just seems to move forward in a preset direction, slowly destroying everything in his path. It returns to a style of horror that is mostly only in the original film in that franchise, a Godzilla that doesn't really care about humanity. It's not a creature of vengeance, not really. It's this pained organic machine of destruction, and humanity and humanity's buildings just happens to be standing in its way. This industrial aesthetic also made Anno a great match for Kamen Rider. Both the original series and the Ishinomori manga have a very industrial working class setting. In the manga, Shocker wants to create an endless mechanized world of factories and industry. As the main character Hongo says, if Shocker wins,
humanity will be puppets whose sole purpose is to work for Shocker. Nature will be taken over and replaced by factories and cities. The world will become a cold, barren desert.
But notably, in the manga, we do see a population resisting this. We see labor struggles, we see protests against pollution, and we see communities. Whereas in contrast, in 2023's Shin Kamen Rider, the world feels oddly void. It's similarly a world of industry. The film delights in matching that aesthetic and having rows of smokestacks and quarries and factories. But it's oddly empty. The movie is mostly Kamen Rider and villainous Shocker agents fighting in a rusted, half-spent world. It's mostly a ghost town. Even the government exists only in the form of two agents who watch the events from the sidelines. For the most part, the only extras in the film are some soldiers, the villains, and a few factory workers who have been brainwashed to work for Shocker. So we don't really get a sense of natural communities, of normal villages and towns, which would usually give some sort of comfort in this story. Instead, it's just so detached, so alien. It's almost as if Shocker's plans from the original manga have succeeded. So it presents this really strange atmosphere where Kamen Rider is doing his best to save the world, but as the audience, it's sometimes unclear whether that world even still exists. In the structure of the film, evil mad scientists are dealt with methodically, and each has increasingly bizarre ideas on how to save humanity. So it's already agreed from the outset, humanity needs saving. Something has gone wrong. There's something here that needs to be corrected. But how do we save humanity? Well, what if we unleashed an epidemic? Epidemics are good, actually. What if we brainwashed everyone? That might make things better. What if we just literally sent everyone to hell? That might be an idea. These plans would feel more incongruous if the whole setting didn't genuinely seem so submerged in liminal nothingness. There was once something here, people here, but it's long gone. How do we reconstruct that? How do we save whatever this is? In that way, Shin Kamen Rider is, for me, one of the most effective post-COVID films, in that it captures one of my central fears since that time. A fear, not exactly that the world is ending, but that it's disappearing. Thanks again, everyone on my Patreon. It really, really helps me to do these videos, particularly during these summer months, which are kind of hard when you're living the adjunct life and there aren't classes for a few months. But this has made it a lot easier. The good news about that is you'll probably see more videos from me over the next few months. I also have a little backlog of bonus videos on the Patreon now too, including a review of G-Quack's The Beginning, where I also give my ranking on Gundam TV shows as a whole, as well as a review of that shitty Netflix Gundam. I'm also planning on releasing a bonus video on Hideaki Anno as an actor to accompany this one, so if that sounds like stuff you're interested in, please consider signing up. While we're here, I also want to thank Maria for providing the voice acting on the Kamen Rider quote in this video. If you like my stuff, I'm sure you'll enjoy hers. Her recent video, Weird and Comfy Japanese Horror, is one of my favorite video essays of the year. It's sensitive and well observed, and it guides the audience through a lot of cool, under-discussed stuff. Speaking of favorite video essays of the year, I also got to recommend this video by Sundoku Diving, titled Moving Through Mist. It's witty and perceptive, and it does this really cool thing where the video initially is about one thing, and then it expands its scope really rapidly in a very beautiful way. It really deserves more views as well, so again, if you're looking for more content in a similar vein to what I do, I give it my highest recommendation. Okay, back to the video. It's a little bit embarrassing how big a part of my psychic development Twitter has been. Since the late 2000s, it's a platform I've been on in various forms, and for all its faults, as much as I would complain about it and take many, many breaks from it, it was also a place that was vital in my growth as someone who wanted to analyze art and hopefully make some art. As a teenager, I would check Twitter because the critics who I was following at the time would fire off these conversational takes about the films they had seen. It was exciting to me, and it was also where fandom percolated. Pretty much everything I've done in fandom has been directly through Twitter. It was a huge part of me promoting these very videos. And then, because it was bought by one guy whose brain has been fried by horse tranquilizers and the culture wars, the website was just destroyed. Overnight, it was just hollowed out and turned into a ghost town, populated now mostly by blue-check shocker agents. And most of the websites that I used to engage in artistic criticism with are gone, or if they still exist, they're shadows of their former selves. And I know in the grand scheme of things, this is a very small complaint. Globally, the right wing are hollowing out social safety nets, doing infrastructure vandalism, and putting people in concentration camps. My actual job, academia, is itself disappearing. Institutions choosing to believe that if they just don't comment on genocide, don't criticize the government, and don't fight back as they're being actively dismantled, then eventually they'll be left alone. Part of why the Ghibli AI trend was so antagonizing to people, I think, was the goading sense of taking something imbued with meaning and making it meaningless. Taking something that is loved because of its sense of being handcrafted and artisanal and mechanically reproducing it, creating an endless hall of mirrors of memes and cultural detritus. There's an obviously brazen aspect to this. It's saying the world you knew, the things you found meaningful, are disappearing. And we like that. We will mechanize the art you value and endlessly reproduce it with algorithms. We will make it mean whatever we want it to mean. Everything you hold dear will become the same thing, sludge. Of course, the Shin films themselves could be and are accused of their own repetition. That's the central critique of this era, that Anno is escaping into his childhood, avoiding the world in order to play with his toys. But I would offer that there is a handcrafted material aspect to these movies that makes them stand apart from our current algorithmic fascism. In Shin Kamen Rider, tinny sound effects from the original series are used alongside iPhone and GoPro footage. Squibs of bright blood explode alongside shots of artificial plastically CGI. As an homage to the series, action scenes jump from established locations to abandoned rock quarries, and arch stylistic dialogue and cartoony fight scenes stands alongside moments of pause and melancholy. The camera will linger on abandoned train tracks with a sense of sadness. The hyper-artificial exists alongside moments of calm reality. This is the world that Anno loved growing up, but he's exploring a sadness in it, along with a stylistic joy. At one point, In a documentary on the making of Shin Eva, Anno talks about his childhood love of Tetsujin 28. He says he was particularly fascinated by the episodes of that anime where Tetsujin would be damaged, would lose an arm or a leg. In maybe the most revealing part of that whole documentary, a documentary in which Anno desperately did not want to be focused on, he states that the armless Tetsujin would often remind him of his own father. Anno's father seems to have been abusive towards him. In Anno's words, he hated the world, and he often suffered from his father's resentment. His father had lost his leg in a workplace accident, and Anno reflects that when he would draw robots, they had always suffered damage. He would always draw them with missing limbs. My preference for things that are broken, Anno says, is probably rooted in my father's missing leg. My dad symbolized something always missing in life. Maybe that's where I find incompleteness is good. It might explain my robot obsession too. It lets me express my dad. One of the reasons this is so powerful to me is that it's the fragmentary nature of Anno's work that I find so interesting. When Evangelion comes to a close, it doesn't bother me that I don't really understand what Seilei's plan was, or that I don't really get what the angels are, because what the series has sacrificed for in plot legibility, it's made up for in emotional intensity and clarity. For the young Anno, the flaws in Tetsujin, its ability to be wounded, granted it a verisimilitude and allowed him a way into processing his relationship with his father. And so, Anno's toys were never pristine objects. They were always broken, weathered, incomplete things. Their beauty was located in their flaws, in Tetsujin's missing limbs, in the weathered, imperfect nature of physical effects, and in the artificiality of unreal images. At the end of Shin Kamen Rider, the narrative's overarching conflict hasn't really been resolved. Shocker is still out there, and they still want to save the world by completely destroying it. And they still have power, but some kind of ideological process has been made. Unlike the previous Shin films, it's less a story about sorting through the muck of politics to save the world than it is a story about having the courage to want to save that world in the first place. That psychic development is in itself presented as transformative. In the final scene, the desaturated hues that dominated the film give way to saturated greens and blues. If there's something I still find radical and exciting about Anno's late period work, it's this. A plea with the audience to externalize, to accept the risk of loss and pain if it means living an authentic life. It presents a decision to engage with the outside world and to believe in that world, even if it's flawed, as in itself restorative. So, as much as these late films can feel more distanced from the audience, I still think there's something very intimate about pursuing this idea. In Shin Kamen Rider, lead actor Sosuke Ikimatsu is excellent at portraying this ethos. He looks like he holds a certain level of damage, but he's still someone willing to try his best to live in the world and also to fight for it. There's one scene that I think sums this up beautifully. He's placed center frame and he removes his mask and he cries. And he cries for a good deal of time. And it's not the kind of cry you see a lot in films. It's ugly and messy. It's the kind of cry where you can hear the wet snot and saliva in between harsh intakes of breath. But eventually, he composes himself. And then he gets back to work.